three things. And these three things, if you could just remember them, then it would help you to interpret a confidence interval. State the confidence level, describe the, in this case, the population proportion that you're estimating, and then give the endpoints and then interpret them in context. So kind of a three-step thing. What I'm going to do now is attempt to do the same thing, but for hypothesis tests. How do you interpret a hypothesis test? So I'm going to give you the template, and you can use this template as your kind of model to write the conclusion of a hypothesis test for step 5, until you get a sense of, you know, as we work through lots of problems, what maybe a better way to interpret the conclusion using layman's terms. So I'm going to create a grid similar to the grid that we created for type 1, type 2 errors. However, in this one, up at the top, I'm going to put the decision instead of on the side. In a hypothesis test, there's two things we can do, only two things. And we're forced to do these. We can't decide which one we do. We have to use the data to determine which one we do. And that is, we can reject the null hypothesis or not. That is the only thing that we can do as a researcher or a statistician. Those are the only two things. Over on this column, or this title over here, I'm just going to say, where is the claim? Remember that we can put the claim in the null hypothesis, or we can put the claim in the alternative hypothesis. So for the first row, we'll say that the null hypothesis is the claim. And if the null hypothesis is not the claim, then it must be the case that the alternative hypothesis is the claim. So again, 4 possibilities, because we can only have 2 possibilities when we make the decision, and the claim can only appear in 2 different places. So again, I'm going to write my little graphic here with the null and the alternative in each of the 4 cells. And then for this row, the null hypothesis is the claim. So I'm just going to write the word claim here next to the null hypothesis in this row. And then down here, the alternative is the claim. So I'm going to write the word claim in the alternative. Then as we go from column to column, if we reject the null hypothesis in the first column there, I will indicate that by crossing out the null hypothesis. And just to be sure, I'll circle the one that I think is true based on the decision. Over here in a similar way, we're not going to reject the null hypothesis. So if there's evidence, then it would be evidence for the null hypothesis, because we're not going to reject it. All right, so there's 4 scenarios, and the way that we interpret the decision, and the decision is up here, how would we interpret this decision to reject the null hypothesis? Well, we're going to look at our graphic here, and we're going to say what we did. What we did is reject the null hypothesis here, and in the process, we rejected the claim. And so the way that we're going to write up the interpretation, the conclusion, is we're going to say something like this. There is enough evidence, and the enough evidence is always based on the level of alpha that is established. And what did we do? There's enough evidence to reject the claim. That. And then what comes next would be the claim in words whatever that claim happened to be. And you'll want to say it in context. So for example, if the claim said that the mean was equal to 32, then we would say there is enough evidence to reject the claim that the mean peanut butter amount is 32 ounces, something like that. So we're going to have one of these for each of these 4 cells. They're all different, but you can use this grid to refer to help you get started in writing the conclusion, that 5th step of the hypothesis test. And here, the claim was the null hypothesis, and we didn't reject it. And so we're going to say this: there is not enough evidence to reject the claim. That's okay. And then here, you again describe the claim from the null hypothesis. So again, if the mean was 32 in the null hypothesis, we would say there is not enough evidence to reject the claim that the mean amount of peanut butter in the peanut butter jars is 32 ounces. Now, sometimes instead of there is enough, another way to say that is that there is sufficient evidence. And over here, there is, instead of writing not enough, we could write insufficient. So I think you'll see it written in both versions, sufficient or insufficient. Continuing along, in this scenario down here, we rejected the null hypothesis in favor of the alternative while the claim was sitting down there. So we rejected the null hypothesis, and we've shown support for the claim. So we're going to say this: there is evidence to support the claim that, and again, depending upon what the alternative hypothesis says, what we're going to do here is we're going to describe the claim in now the alternative hypothesis. So if this was the mean is less than 32, and that was our claim, the way we would write this out or describe this is there is evidence to support the claim that the peanut butter manufacturer is filling the jars on average with less than 32 ounces of peanut butter. So we're describing the claim in each case. Since the claim is up here for these problems, we're going to describe the claim in the null hypothesis. Down here, the claim is going to be the alternative hypothesis, so we're going to describe the claim that appears in the alternative hypothesis. All right, and then the last case is, in this case, we failed to reject the null hypothesis, and hence we failed to show support for the claim. So that's what we're going to say. There is not enough evidence or insufficient evidence to support the claim. That, and then you want to describe the claim again from the from the alternative hypothesis. So that's it. This will kind of give you a roadmap of how you can begin to interpret. Notice nowhere in here will I use the word prove. Because of our one sample, this proves that they're cheating us and they're not filling those peanut butter jars with 32 ounces. Remember, everything that we do is based on a single sample among millions and millions of other possible samples. And so we're not sure when we take a sample if we have one that's representative of the whole population. So we have to be very, very cautious when we write these statements. We could go further in these statements and even say, well, this one sample showed evidence to support that the manufacturer was cheating us. But in order to make such a bold claim, we would like to see more studies, and we'd like to test maybe a larger sample of peanut butter containers, or we would like to replicate the study at another time. Okay, so that's it. That's how the interpretation goes. So now what I'd like to do is to take you through a couple of examples. You're familiar with this one. I'm not going to write down the hypotheses again or take times to do this, because this is the same problem that we just did, number 15. And as you recall, those were our hypotheses. All right. So I want to focus your attention right here. The null hypothesis is rejected. And so what that means to me is I'm going to cross out this hypothesis because that was rejected. And this is the one that we have then evidence for. So based on if we do in fact reject the null hypothesis, state the conclusion. All right, so this one here was we're rejecting the null hypothesis and the claim is in the alternative. So I see it right here. We're rejecting the null hypothesis and the claim is in the alternative. So the way we're going to start this one is we're going to say there is evidence, sufficient evidence, or enough evidence to support the claim, that. And then we're going to describe this claim right here. But we're going to do it in context. So there's the claim that the proportion is greater than 0.399. So you can see I'm using that same verbiage. There is evidence to support the claim that. And then all of this here is the word version, you know, write in words, in other words, the verbal description of that hypothesis. There is evidence to support the claim that, and then the proportion of students who enroll at Joliet Junior College have a 6-year baccalaureate graduation rate greater than 0.399. So I'm really just defining this proportion. The longest time it takes is to actually write down what the meaning of this proportion is in words. And notice I actually use the word proportion in there. Later on, we'll get in, we'll get away from this template and we'll start saying things like this. There's evidence to support the claim that on average, Joliet Junior College students complete their baccalaureate degree at a higher rate than the national average. But right now, as you're getting used to this, you know, maybe this version would work. All right, continuing to the next problem on this sheet. Again, this sheet was, I think, maybe included in the handouts from our previous session. So you have it online, you have it at the D2L site, you have it in one of the emails. It just probably was not the one I sent this morning. So, and these will be included in the notes. All right, the next one is the one about Jimbo's Pizza. You may recall that these were the hypotheses. So let's say the null hypothesis is not rejected for this one. So this goes the other way. The null hypothesis was not rejected. So the null hypothesis then is plausible. And then we're not showing support for the alternative because the null was not rejected. So going to our grid, we failed to reject, let's see if I can put it up here. Here it is down here. We failed to reject the null hypothesis and the claim was in the alternative. So there's not enough evidence to support the claim. We didn't reject the null hypothesis to support the claim. So there's not enough evidence to support the claim. And that's exactly how we'll write this one out. There's not sufficient evidence to support the claim that the new system reduces delivery time. So this one I chose to write out in more layman's terms than just kind of following the formulaic approach. The formulaic approach would be something like this. There is not sufficient evidence to support the claim that the mean delivery time of Jimbo's pizza delivery times is less than 48 minutes. I didn't say that here. I could have, but I chose to say it in more layman's terms. What did you find evidence for? Basically, the new system didn't reduce delivery time. Okay, I'd like to turn it over to you. And again, for some reason, I didn't print these off, but I want to give you like 5 minutes to practice 2 of them. So on one of the worksheets, you're going to see problem 37 and 38. And so all we're asking you to do here is to, again, write down the 2 hypotheses, step 1. And then if the sample data indicate that the null hypothesis should not be rejected, then write the conclusion. So be sure that you write the hypotheses and you write the claim next to one of the hypotheses because you'll use that to write your conclusion. Okay, so what is this problem about? E-cigarettes. There's been some national studies on this, and the CDC found that about 2.8% of high school students use electronic cigarettes. So they vape tobacco, I guess, is what that means. And there was a high school counselor who said, you know what? I mean, I've seen a lot of it. I've seen it in lockers. I've seen it out in cars. It seems to be a lot more prevalent at my school than it does at all schools. So I think it's a little higher than 2.8%. So the high school counselor is making a claim because the counselor is concerned that at her school, the usage is actually higher. Okay, so in this last sentence here, that's where you're going to find your claim and your inequality sign and the alternative hypothesis. Okay, so write the hypotheses and then write the conclusion in part B. Okay, I'm going to show the work for this one, and then I'm going to go down and reveal the next one in case you don't have it. Okay, so here's the second one. It's about migraines, and again from the CDC. The CDC claims, based on their extensive research, that about 15.2% of Americans suffer from migraine headaches. And then you have this massage therapist who says, you know what, based on my massage techniques, that I have a technique that can reduce the frequency, the number of times that migraines occur, and the intensity, how much they hurt. It has a technique. So basically, she's saying she wants to make the claim that her clients will actually suffer from migraines at a lower rate than the national average. She's saying that her technique works, which would reduce the percentage of migraines from the 15.2% to something lower. Okay. For the first one, here are the hypotheses. And we're going to fail to reject the null hypothesis. So if there's evidence to support the null. And we can't show support for the alternative, which is the claim. So there, we don't have evidence to support the claim. That's what you want to say. And here's how I said it. I used, instead of not enough, in this case, I used insufficient evidence to support the claim that a higher percentage of students at the counselor school use e-cigs as compared to the national average. I could have said here, there's insufficient evidence to support the claim that the proportion of high school students at the counselor schools is greater than 2.8%, or the percentage is greater than 2.8%. Okay, and then the last one here, again, the massage therapist thinks that, you know, her techniques will lead to less of a incidence of migraines. So it's going to be less than the national average of 15.2%. And that's her claim. A study is done and result in data that indicate that the null hypothesis should be rejected. So we're rejecting the null hypothesis in favor of the claim. We're rejecting the null hypothesis in support of the alternative, which is in support of the claim. So we're going to say that there's evidence to support the claim. And that's what we say here, that the massage therapist program reduces the frequency and intensity of migraine headaches. Of course, on average, this is more the layman's terms that would be used. You could also say there's sufficient evidence to support the claim that the massage therapist program leads to migraine headaches in less than 15.2% of her clients, something like that. The other thing about hypotheses, I did it here, and hopefully you did it as well. It's a hassle to write out the definition of these parameters that we use in our hypotheses, but I'll require that you do that in every case. So if you're going to define a P in your null hypothesis, you should start with the word proportion. The proportion of what? And that's how both of these work.